This is a recording about two of Blake's poems from his Songs of Innocence and Experience, Infant Joy and Infant Sorrow, and we're looking at that in terms of paper 2 of AQA's English Literature A-level paper, which is about social and political protest. So we start with a reminder, just a quick one, of some of the key phrases that we might be looking at if we want to write about this poem on the exam for AQA. Either of these two poems. So those terms that are there on screen now all have some relevance and some usefulness, some more than others obviously, to these two poems. But as we'll see with both of them, the political element is more implied than stated directly, and it's something that the reader is encouraged to make sense of themselves, it seems. But we can certainly see how these two poems could do a lot of work for us on the exam if we were wanting to write about some of the key themes that occur in the different questions that have come up so far, which will give us a bit of a guidance on the sort of things that might come up in future questions. As ever, we'll be looking to analyse along some of those areas that are now on screen, and its linking methods to politics, to protest, and to Blake's own quite unique ideas that are going to make the essay that you might write successful. And the key to any essay is that you answer the question that you've been set. And those were some of the themes that have been set on questions up to the time at which this recording has been made in 2024. And whichever of those questions you were set, you have to link the poems directly to that. And if you can't, then it isn't really worth using those poems. And that's something you have to be aware of. You may have favourite poems from the collection, and you should really, with 48 poems or so. You can't know each one of them as well, but you have to be able to be flexible about not using the same poem for every single essay. This one clearly, these two today, clearly lend themselves, for instance, to that second question around parenting and personal relationships too. Certainly authority figures. And then empower to resist as well, we'll see, is a strong part. And of course, joy is a key word in one of the poems. So quite a few of those questions that have come up would have been useful for the two infant poems. So let's turn to the actual poems themselves. I'll actually start with Infant Joy. Now, Infant Joy, of course, these two poems illustrate one of the things that Blake does, which is that he pairs poems. He wrote and published the Innocence poems first, and then added the Experience section another sort of 4 or 5 years later. Whether he always intended to do that or not is perhaps a point for discussion. But that's part of the meaning of the poems often, and that's why you'll often end up writing about these paired poems in an essay, because the Innocence poem is interpreted by the Experienced one, and the Experienced one has a lingering sort of meaning or echo from the first Innocence one. The Innocence Infant Joy poem is a typical Innocence poem in a way, and it provides us with an example of the problem with the Innocence poems is that they're quite slight, and they can sometimes feel like there's nothing to say about them, and that they're certainly not very political. We can see here, it seems that what's unusual is that a baby seems to be speaking, which they don't, and tells us that they are only 2 years old, and then asks, or seems to reply to the question rather, what shall I call thee? So someone else seems to ask that question, a parent perhaps, and the baby replies by noticing that they are happy and claiming that they know that their name is Joy. And it seems likely that that's the reply, sweet joy before thee, or it could be the infant spreading that joy around. And then we get a sort of parental, I'll call you that because you're so sweet, and you smile and I sing. So it seems to be a kind of nursery rhyme, a sort of poem about a parent looking at a child. Presumably, if you wanted to read it literally, the child doesn't speak, but perhaps seems quite a joyful baby from almost day one, which again probably isn't quite possible, in that babies don't really start to smile until a few weeks after their birth. But either way, the young child represents a joyful child, and therefore is named Joy by the parent. So what could we make out of that if we were trying to do anything other than a very simplistic restating of the poem? Well, there's some interesting ideas there, and the main one is that Blake seems to be saying that children should be paid attention to, that they should be listened to, that they should be given a freedom to sort of follow their own path rather than have someone impose upon them. And indeed, it seems to fit with 20th century notions that would have been alien to or unknown to Blake, like existentialism, which says that a person is born without a fate and without an identity, really, and that we write that fate and identity ourselves. And we are free to do that, and that's radically freeing. And the French philosophers like Sartre and Camus in the 20th century seem to say that this is both a liberating thing because you're not tied to any kind of prejudice or any kind of script that's written to you. You're not bound by any will of God because there is no God in that sort of existential view of the world. So that's quite liberating because you can do what you want and be whoever you want. You don't have to be who other people tell you to be or what you're born to be. You're not born to be anything. It's also quite frightening because you've got nothing to sort of support you and guide you, and you don't quite know where you're going or what to do. Here, again, it seems to be part of that, but it also, it could then sort of be linked to that more 21st century idea that what we're born as in terms of gender and sex, for instance, is not a fixed thing like we perhaps in the past had thought it was, and that we will create our own identity as we become an adult, and that could be an identity of choice that doesn't correspond to our birth identity. And so again, it's that idea of not fixing somebody, not labeling somebody according to what we think they should be, but letting them shape themselves and find their own path and decide who they are. That's quite a radical political idea, and one that challenges some people still today. They find that difficult to cope with and want to fall back on the old certainties, particularly around that issue of gender and sex, which wouldn't have been a particularly strong issue in Blake's time, but was there in the background in a kind of rather hidden way. There were questions around gender identity that were being raised back then too. This poem doesn't specifically speak about gender, but it speaks about freedom and it speaks about individuality, I suppose, and it also speaks about, of course, joy. So it suggests that freedom leads to joy. If you allow a child to express itself, to find itself, to be itself as it wishes to be rather than how you think it should be, they will find joy. And so for Blake, unaware of existentialism or any issues around gender identity, really, he would have perhaps linked those ideas to the philosopher Rousseau, who was a writer who was alive just before he was writing these poems, and who has written about the way in which society and culture inscribes us with a certain way of living, which is restricting and unhelpful and untrue to our true nature. And Rousseau, argued that we should get back to nature, our selfhood, our innocent self, our kind of Eden-like naivety and untroubled state, and live like that without the sort of impositions of culture and so-called civilization. And those were pretty challenging and radical ideas in the 18th century, during the time Blake's writing these poems. Here, simplicity as well, and naivety and sheer simple innocence are being portrayed. And again, we can talk about here something that we will talk about with all the innocence poems that are very simplistic. And you can choose a number of these, like The Blossom, for instance, would be another, and say that what they say is Blake is telling us this is a world of purity and innocence and untroubled, uncontrolled freedom. And why can't the world always be like this? Why can't we live in a kind of Eden or paradise? Why do we have to believe this Christian myth that Eden has been denied us and that we have to live in this fallen and unhappy world? Why can't we find happiness, joy in this life? And that's a radical protest too, and all real radical politics comes from that wish of people to have a happy life and challenge those in authority to allow them and give them the conditions in which they can have that. And as the Industrial Revolution grew during Blake's lifetime and shortly afterwards, that became more and more problematic, in which people found themselves living lives of great sort of distress and suffering and short unhappy lives in which they laboured constantly and had no freedom and very little leisure time, lives that we certainly wouldn't accept today as being at all happy or worthwhile, really. And the protest against that came about through radical leftist and sort of Marxist and other class-based politics was to say that the working class that had emerged in these conditions needed a better deal. They needed to be treated fairly because they were actually creating massive wealth for the middle and upper classes as well, sometimes, particularly the middle classes, and not really getting a share of it. So again, out of a very simple seeming poem, there can be some quite radical political ideas. In terms of its form and its poetic style, we could talk about that too as being very straightforward, but a slightly ragged and strange, with repetitions where there might be rhymes, with part rhymes, not really any good rhymes except towards the end there with while and smile. Most of the rest of it is either repetition or not very convincing rhymes. So there's a slight oddity, and that I happy am in the middle of the first stanza creates a slightly awkward effect that may be designed to reflect on the child's inability to speak fluent English, I don't know. Now, if we look at some of the questions that have come up before, no escape from constraints was the first theme of the first question ever set. Well, here, this does seem to see a world without constraints and see the advantages of that. Parents can be oppressive and controlling. Well, here's the opposite of that. What happens if parents are not oppressive and controlling, but are listening and responsive? There's not really any clear representation of religion in the poem, but it talks about the third question ever set talked about religion being not about comfort and joy. And here, Blake offers a view of joy and says that, you know, if we are going to have a religion, it is going to have to be about joy. Has the human spirit got power to resist? Well, there doesn't need to be resistance in this poem. This portrays a world in which resistance isn't necessary because there's no controlling authority. But we might think that's a rather naive view of the world, and that in reality, there isn't a world in which there's no controlling authority. And if we kind of think there is, we might be vulnerable to some kind of oppression because we innocently, naively think we're free when we're not, maybe. This isn't really about marginalised people, which was one of the questions, but it's certainly about personal relationships here, parent-child relationships. And here it talks about liberation and empowerment, definitely, that if a parent treats a child with the proper respect, it can create a liberated and empowered individual. All authority figures might be unkind and lack compassion. We'll see that in Infant Sorrow, but here this is the opposite. This is what authority figures can do if they wish to be compassionate and kind. And joy and happiness is possible in an innocent state. It seems to be what Blake is saying, but we always have that slight question, and Infant Sorrow offers us the opposite view, that this is how the world might be, could be, should be. But if we believe that the world is like this, we're probably going to be very badly disappointed fairly quickly, or we're going to be vulnerable to some kind of oppressive control because we won't notice that we're being controlled when we are. So Infant Joy certainly, at face value, is a poem of pure joy, and there isn't much hint of anything else underneath the surface. But it does only really exist meaningfully in comparison with its fellow poem, an obvious comparison of Infant Sorrow in the volume of experience. And here we see the best example, and it's one reason why I've taken this as our second video of my ones I'm doing on Blake, is because it's a great example of what happens when you contrast innocence and experience. So in this experienced world, suddenly everything is controlled and limited, and there's also a cynical reality here, a cynical view of reality, a cynical awareness, and that awareness leads to not freedom, but distress, and ultimately sort of a sulking acceptance of the misery of real life. So this might be the dream hope life of Infant Joy contrasted to the reality of what life is really like. So here the mother groans and the father weeps. So there's emotion that's very unpleasant and unwanted, and so the whole environment is suddenly the opposite of that joyous environment we saw in the first poem. Everything's going bad from moment one. This is an unhappy birth, perhaps an unwanted child, and the child is aware into the dangerous world I've leapt. So the world is dangerous. The child is very aware of that, and that's the truth about the world as seen in the world of experience. So there's many dangers which the innocent baby doesn't notice, and it leaps into that world because it too is a powerful, forceful figure, but one that's risking everything and is probably going to fall and harm itself because it's helpless, it's naked, and it's piping loud. It's like a fiend hid in a cloud. So you've got this beautiful sort of baby, but inside is a devil, a fiend. So this is a view of childbirth and having a baby that comes from the kind of more typical, perhaps, view of parents who are stressed and tired and trying to look after a new child who never sleeps and is constantly in need of care and looking after. And it's being a parent is incredibly exhausting and draining activity for many people. And so we have the reality here versus the dream. The child struggles against its father's hands. It's got swaddling bands, which was the kind of bandages they used to wrap around babies to stop them struggling and crawling away. But you can imagine, again, that struggling and striving, the vivid STR, sort of hard consonant sound there, creates this sense of the child wanting to release itself for freedom. But it's bound and weary, so it gives up the fight, eventually knowing that these bandages are going to constrain it impossibly, and all it can do is sulk. And so we have a sort of acceptance of the state of things, but a miserable acceptance, a bleak poem in total. It's about the reality of childhood, but it's also obviously can quickly be applied politically as a metaphor for kind of general authority, control, restraint. What's it like to be oppressed, held down, told that you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that, being literally restrained in handcuffs and shackles, being locked up, being told where you can go and where you can't go. And so this is the world as it had developed during Blake's time, no doubt. This is the world of the 18th century Britain with its tight political controls upon the masses that were starting to become this sort of real entity for the first time, this group of people who were perhaps moving into the towns and cities to work in the factories, and suddenly they're becoming potentially a threat to the peace and order that the upper and middle classes had got used to in their their kind of happy paradise that they were living in prior to the Industrial Revolution. So there's a lot of politics underneath the surface of this poem, and it certainly has an atmosphere, doesn't it, of discomfort and unhappiness, a sort of furious disdain, but then that sulking, giving up. There's no point, the revolution will never come, seems to be the suggestion at the end. Or does it suggest that what happens is that the people who are oppressed, yes, they sulk, they sort of brood upon their unhappiness, but it's a kind of lingering problem that's going to come back and bite us at some point. Whether that's just in terms of the child that's brought up to be unhappy and then is waiting for its chance to let out that unhappiness on somebody else. So if you mistreat a child, it's a common theme in stories of great, horrible, terrible sort of psychopathic people, that their childhood was terrible too, and that having been mistreated, they then grew up to be terribly damaged people who went out and inflicted that damage on other people. Or politically, if you oppress people for so long, as Marx was come to say in the middle of the 19th century, long after Blake's death, that if you keep oppressing people, eventually they will rise up. The stronger the pressure you place upon them, the more violent that revolution against you is going to be eventually. They will hold it in for so long, but eventually that resentment will rise to the surface and they'll take control of things. So the poem has that revolutionary long-term suggestion, I think, hidden within it too. In terms of looking at our questions, yes, no escape from constraints. There seems to be here. This poem is absolutely about that, about how life is full of constraints and there's really no way out. Oppressive and controlling parents, again, absolutely. If you want to be a parent who's going to oppress and control, this is the result. If you try to control the child too much, says Blake. And it goes on to perhaps reflect on what's in The Schoolboy as another poem, that if you were doing that question on parenting, You could certainly bring that one in too, as, mistreatment of children creates unhappiness that, is long lasting and has long lasting effects. The human spirit has power to resist or not. Well, this is resistance, but it's a resistance that's kind of passive and rather defeated. No hope for the marginalised. It's not clear that there's marginalised figures in this poem, but it's clear that there just seems to be little hope. And personal relationships here are anything but liberating and empowering. This is what happens if you don't liberate and empower the people around you, whether it's your children or anybody else that you're involved with. If you try to control them and hold them down and restrict them, eventually this is going to lead to very much an unhappy situation for everybody involved. Authority figures lacking kindness and compassion. Well, we might sort of say that that's there, but we might also have some compassion ourselves for the parents who perhaps have struggled to come to terms with it. Not everybody is a natural parent, and most parents find having a baby a great shock and a terrible drain on energy in the first few years. So it's unnatural that at times you're frustrated and desperate, really, and you make desperate mistakes. Innocence leads to joy and happiness was what we saw in the first of the infant poems, and here this is what happens if you don't allow that innocence to have its way, to give the freedom and hope to the innocent. Leads to joy and happiness. To do the opposite, to try and strain and control, leads to misery. But of course, again, we might say that this dangerous world that this baby leaps into, we can see why a parent might instantly want to wrap it up and, for very good motives, to protect it from this itself. And that's the dilemma of a parent as the child grows older. And the child wants to expand, and a teenager, even into your 20s, you're going to want to live a certain life that's your own, but the parent's watching on, thinking, how far do I try to intervene when I feel that my child's making mistakes? So a very vivid experience poem, a perfect example of what happens in the experience poems. They're much richer, much more emotionally involving, much more powerful, much more realistic, full of a vigour that's not there in the innocence poems. And that's a sad reality of what Blake's saying about innocence and experience, that to experience the world to its full, you have to also experience the unhappiness and the terrors and the horrors and the pains of the world too. If you want to live in a sort of blissful state of happiness, it's likely that you're going to have to shut yourself off from reality and live in a sort of half world of innocence.